Tonight, we're going to talk about a very interesting subject, at least interesting to me. I hope so for you too. And that's Kriya Yoga and practicing the presence of God. And at first, it might seem like we're combining two different things, but in fact, we're not at all. Practicing the presence of God is not mental. It's not that we remember God. It's actually being in the vibration of God. And Kriya Yoga, the practice of Kriya Yoga, helps us to reconnect with that vibration. So let me talk first a little bit more about the vibrational aspect. Lahiri Mahashaya said something very interesting. He said that the consciousness of God is completely still. This is God beyond creation. There's awareness. We can't even imagine it very well with our restless minds and our thinking nature that's constantly skipping here, there, and everywhere. But if you read the explanations of great saints and those who have achieved that state, there is stillness, but with high awareness. And in fact, in the Christian Bible, it says, "Be still and know that I am God." And so as the mind becomes more and more still, we connect with the stillness of God. So Lahiri Mahashaya said that God's consciousness is perfect stillness, but it's also got certain qualities to it, as we have heard before. Sat Chit Ananda. Sat is existence, Chit is awareness, and Ananda is bliss. So think of still, blissful consciousness that is always there, that awareness. Then there's no creation in that, no outward creation, I should say. Then Lahiri said, God takes, he used the number 1%. I think he was probably talking metaphorically. God takes 1% of his consciousness, and that still consciousness, which he called still prana, he makes that prana dynamic, that energy of awareness. He makes it dynamic, and that dynamic energy is in duality. Because, as Master explained, everything is like a movie. He would sometimes take some of his disciples to a movie, and there'd be the drama going on, and the action, and the hero, and the heroine, and the villain, and all of these things. And in the midst of all of that action, Master would tap the disciples on the shoulder and point up to the beam of light coming from the projection booth. And he would say, see, it's all just a play of light and shadow. So that light and shadow, it has to be both, or you won't have any movie going on, any drama. And so in this world, you can't have creation without duality. And so God takes 1% of the still prana, and he makes it dynamic. And that's got duality to it. The night and the day, the plus and the minus, even down to the atomic and subatomic level of particles. In the atom, there is a positive charge and a negative charge. Positive charge is in the center of the atom. Negative charge is in the electrons that go around that. And we think, at least those of us who came up in schools some long time ago, we think of the atom as a big, like marble with some little lines around it, right around it, and that represents the atom, and the lines around it are the electron. In fact, I read that a better image of it would be to see the center of the atom about the size of a large grapefruit or a small ball, beach ball, and those electrons that go around are at the far end of a big cricket stadium or a soccer stadium, and everything else is space. So really, even at the atomic level, there's hardly any matter in creation, but it's a delusion of it, and delusion held together by a positive and negative charge. So at any rate, going on, so God creates this delusion through the vibration of duality. But then Lahiri said something very interesting. He said that as the energy descends from the various chakras, the vibration gets more and more restless. And so at the point between the eyebrows, or at the 1,000-petal lotus, it's very still vibration. That's why we meditate. At that point, we're trying to bring the energy back into that stillness. And when we do, that stillness is calm enough so that we can perceive our own self, and we can perceive ourself as part of God. But as that energy descends down to the various chakras and out into the world, it gets more and more and more restless, until when the energy is very restless, we can't remember God. And so the practice of Kriya Yoga is primarily meant to bring that restless prana, the outward flowing, downward and outward flowing prana that gets more and more restless. It's meant to, with the practice of the Kriya technique, to withdraw that energy into the deep spine and bring it up to the higher centers into a state of stillness. And in that state, it's not as if we have to think of God or remember God even. We simply are in the presence of God, because that's all there really is. So it would be truer philosophically not to talk about practicing the presence of God, because we're always in the presence of God. It would be better to talk about remembering the presence of God, remembering that we're in that presence, and stilling our consciousness sufficiently so that that memory can go on. Again, as the energy descends down and gets more and more restless and more outgoing through the lower chakras, it awakens in us attachment to the movement of duality, and to the excitement of it all, and to the acquiring and wanting things. And even that is based on likes and dislikes. So everything in a certain sense is based on the dualistic, everything in creation is based on the dualistic nature. And in Patanjali, he says that chitta is located in the area of the heart, the Anahata chakra. And as that chitta, or the primordial, Master talked about it as the primordial power of feeling, the primordial feeling nature. So that tendency to want things or to not want things, to like things, to not like things, not mental, but feeling. When that becomes neutralized or stilled, then we go into the remembrance of who we are. And so Patanjali said, Yogas chitta vritti nirod. Yoga is the neutralization of that primordial feeling nature. And when that becomes still, then we go into a state of yoga. When the mind becomes still, we go into the state of yoga. And so the real remembrance of God is the stilling of the mind and the feelings and the prana within us. And that is the primary central purpose of the technique of Kriya Yoga. And so we practice Kriya Yoga, which is given to us in order to accomplish that. And Master said in the autobiography that Kriya Yoga, he was quoting his Sanskrit teacher Kebalanandaji, that Kriya Yoga is the most effective technique for liberation ever through self-effort ever given to mankind. Why? Because it is the technique that is consciously working on withdrawing that prana and bringing it up to the higher centers, which means also bringing it up to more and more stillness. And so unless we can work with that dynamic, our minds are going to be restless. I once used the analogy, imagine that all of our thoughts are like feathers. So imagine a big feather pillow, and we slit that open and we dump all those thousands of feathers on a big table. And each of those feathers represents a thought or a potential thought. And so when our consciousness is still, all of those feathers are on the table. So now imagine above that table is a ceiling fan. And when that ceiling fan is going around very slowly, those feathers stay on the table. But as that ceiling fan speeds up, it starts to blow those feathers around. And Lahiri said, in fact, the vibration at the base of the spine, at the spiritual eye, the vibration is from 0 to 9. At the base of the spine, it's 100,000. So think here that ceiling fan is revolving around very slowly. At the base of the spine, that downward energy, it's spinning around so fast that you can't even see it. And now, what happens to all of those feathers that are on the table? Well, naturally, that fan blows them all over the place. And so the mind is restless, and we think, oh, we can calm the mind just by going and picking up this feather and bringing it back and that feather, and it's never going to work. And so the practice of our spiritual techniques is not to control the mind directly, not to control those feathers directly, but to control the ceiling fan. And we use pranayama, which is the withdrawal of energy. It's like a rheostat on that ceiling fan, and we turn the speed down farther and farther and farther, and then the feathers stay on the table. The mind becomes calm until in deep, deep meditation, the mind becomes absolutely still. But we can't get there by just working with the mind, because the mind in and of itself is restless. And so we have to work with the prana, and the technique of Kriya Yoga allows us to withdraw that prana and to bring it up to the higher, more still centers. So as we do that, let's say that we do that in the morning with a deep meditation, and we get our minds, we get the prana withdrawn, we get our minds focused and deeply there, and in that we begin to see our own true nature, because we're extensions of God. We're sparks of God. And so as our minds become still, we begin to feel our own joy. It isn't really our own, because we're just extensions of God, but we're feeling God's joy in this particular aspect, in this particular spark or soul. And so we feel His joy, we feel His love. In fact, Master said joy was located at this high center, because joy is part of the stillness of God's consciousness. And then we feel peace, we feel calmness, we feel love, we feel wisdom, we can see light, hear sound, feel God's power, all of those. So aspects of God reside within us, and as our minds become, as the prana withdraws, our minds become still, then we see reflected within us the qualities of God. We don't have to think about it, we don't have to imagine it, we don't have to learn anything. You know, the great saints, many of them are not scholarly at all. Master read 2 or 3 books in his whole life. He just, his guru Sri Yukteswar suggested that he not read books. And he said later he was very grateful for that advice. I mean, he had to as a student and so on, but reading about spiritual aspects. He said he was very grateful for that advice because his consciousness was actually higher than the consciousness of the people who were writing those books. And it would have kind of tainted his consciousness, his thoughts. So he was able to work from that more pure consciousness. Anandamoyi Ma, great woman saint of this last century, attended school only a little bit for just a few months. And she could write a little bit, read a little bit, but she even used to sign her name just with a dot representing infinity. So one would think that, well, she's unschooled. Probably that means she's not very intelligent. Well, that's wrong, of course. But one would also think she's unschooled, therefore she doesn't have knowledge. But you know what happened? She lived in a little village in the Bengal area, Bangladesh, I believe, when she was young. And she, as I said, she didn't attend the village school. But if the district examiner came to examine the students in the school to give them a test to see how they had done with their lessons, the teacher would come before the examiner got there and bring Anandamoyi Ma, who wasn't even a student. He would bring her to the school. Because if the examiner asked a question, the answer would simply appear in front of Anandamoyi Ma, and she could always answer correctly. Answer mathematics correctly, answer whatever questions the examiner would ask. So, see, it isn't intellectual knowledge. It's once you align with truth, once you align with God's consciousness, then you have all of God's consciousness. So Master said, if you really want to know about how God's creation is made, he said, you can try to study it from outside, but you'll never really know. He said, get to know the Creator himself, and he'll explain how he made creation. Master one time in a great samadhi said that in this samadhi he could see universes coming into existence and then out, kind of the process of creation and destruction. And in that state he was filled with joy. He said he just kind of inwardly laughed. He said, "Oh, that's how you do it. That's how you do it." And so all of that creative element was available to him in consciousness, not through study. But he could sit and talk with doctors. He would talk about the speciality of their field with scientists. He could talk in different languages. We had a woman at Ananda village who didn't speak English. She spoke Spanish. This was the mother of one of the members there. And she was out one day, and she came back, and she was in a kind of a stunned state. And her daughter thought maybe she had had a stroke. The mother couldn't even speak. And the daughter got her into a chair, and she said, "Mother, I'll call a doctor, I'll call a doctor." And all the mother could say, "No doctor, no doctor." And so it took some time, an hour or more, for the mother kind of to come back to her normal consciousness. And then she explained that while she was walking, she had a vision of Master Yogananda coming to her and being there, and they had a long conversation. She said, "Do you come here often?" She only spoke Spanish. So in Spanish, she said, "Do you come here often?" And intuitively, she heard his response. He said, "I'm always here." And they had a long conversation. Her daughter said, "What did you talk about?" She said, "Oh, I talked about all you children, what you're going through." And Master was like a mother or a father to her. And so she had this wonderful experience of God's presence. And then it really was life-changing. So see, practicing the presence of God is not something that's mental. It's really getting our vibration to be stiller and stiller, our hearts to be more and more open, our desire for God's presence to be there, because God's presence already is here. We just have to remember that, but we can't remember it if the ceiling fan is spinning too fast and our thoughts and desires are spread all over the place. We have to gradually, day by day, month by month, year by year, we have to learn the process of bringing our energy into a state of stillness, bringing it up to the higher chakras, which the vibration is stiller and stiller. And in that higher state, we will automatically be in the presence of God. And then if we can stay, not just while we're withdrawn in meditation, if we can stay in that state during activity, then we'll feel the presence of God, and people will feel God's presence in us. That's why people were so drawn to Master, so drawn to Swami Kriyananda. They could feel in them the presence of God, and they could imbibe some of that in their own lives. So Kriya Yoga and practicing the presence of God are deeply intertwined and related.
Namaste, everyone. I'd like to continue on this theme now, and I'd like to start with a funny story, a joke that we heard some time ago. A man came to a doctor and he said, "Sir, I think that I must have a very serious life-threatening disease, because when I press my arm, it hurts. When I press my shoulder, it hurts. When I press my head, it hurts. When I press my stomach, it hurts. Everywhere I press, sir, it hurts." And the doctor said, "Well, let's do some tests to find out what's going on." And then after a few days, the doctor called the man back and he said, "Well, I have good news and bad news. The good news is there's absolutely nothing wrong with you. Your body is just fine. But the bad news is you have a broken finger." And this is really what, when we live in the ego, this is what it's like. If we're only living in egoic consciousness, our perception of what's going on is distorted. And even though the pain is just limited to one little finger, to one little ego, we still think that's all that exists is the pain and suffering of that one little ego. And so what the practice of Kriya Yoga does for us is it helps us to enlarge our sense of self-identity. And in doing so, by the more we expand our awareness, the more we clarify our perception of reality, the more we are able to feel the underlying presence of God, the underlying joy of all that permeates all of creation. The term, I just wanted to share this with you because very often we use the expression practicing the presence of God. This comes to us from a Christian saint, Brother Lawrence, who was in medieval times, and he was a very, very simple soul, but very high soul. And he just had this, he was able to live in God consciousness all the time. So for him, practicing the presence of God wasn't a mental exercise. It was his state of consciousness. And so I think that's a better way to understand what we mean by practicing the presence. How do we stay constantly in a state of God awareness? And how does Kriya Yoga fit into this? Well, Master had a beautiful poem, which I'll just paraphrase. He said, "When I was blind, I saw not a door that led to thee, but now my eyes are open, and I see thee everywhere, in every tree, in every leaf, in every flower." And so, until we begin transcending our egoic perception of reality, we are blind. We are living in a world of delusion, of shadows, of insubstantial reality. And the practice of Kriya Yoga, some of you are watching, you already have this practice, but some of you may not. Of course, it's always helpful to read the chapter in Autobiography of a Yogi on the science of Kriya Yoga. But essentially, it's based on the principle that what we're trying to do is to add extra energy through a specific pranayama, extra life force to the centers, the chakras, and the brain, and the higher centers of perception to expand the doors of perception. And by transferring the energy that usually goes out to the senses, by using that same prana in the Kriya Yoga pranayama, and then bringing it up and activating and clarifying our own perception, we begin to rest in the presence of God. Master said that the true altar is not the altar that we have in perhaps our puja room or in our temple with flowers and pictures and murtis, but the true altar upon which we worship God is the spine, the astral spine, and the centers of subtle perception, the chakras. And so what Kriya Yoga does, it works on the principle of magnetism. Ordinarily, in the person of egoic awareness, all the light, the vrittis, the seeds of consciousness from uncounted incarnations, they reside in this astral spine, but they're turned every which way. Master spoke about the thwarting cross currents of ego. And that's what it's like, the thwarting, they offset each other. We get a little glimpse of clarity, but then we have the thought of egoic thought of a desire or an attachment or a anger or whatever it might be. And so we can't ever get that clarity. And as Master talked about, that anguishing sense of monotony, lifetime after lifetime, where we go after this desire, we go after this goal, we go after this inclination, and it always becomes dust in our hands, sand running through our fingers. And so this will be true as long as our consciousness is not aligned in an upward flow. We make a little spiritual progress, and then we get pulled off. We have a little perception of God's presence, and then it gets lost in subconscious thought patterns. And so what the practice of Kriya Yoga does, through magnetically drawing the life force up, it aligns the magnetism. Jyotish was talking about the positive and negative magnetism of everything in creation. Well, so it is with the vrittis, these little vortices of energies within our own spine. And the more we can, through drawing a powerful prana current up the spine, the vrittis get aligned in a north-south polarity, and in that, more and more energy can be generated until the vrittis themselves begin to, the little intensity of their internal integrity, you might say, it begins to dissolve, and they become less and less, they have less and less a grip on our consciousness. And the more this happens, the more we feel freedom, from past tendencies, past habits, past thought patterns, and we're able to direct our thoughts in positive, constructive ways, and the doors of our perception become cleansed. We're able to see truth clearly. And when you look in the eyes of, we had the great blessing of being students and followers of Swami Kriyananda for many, many years, and his eyes were always, if he was sick, if he was well, if he was tired, if he was vibrant, if he was focused on his work, if he was relaxing, his eyes were always clear with the light of God, because there were no longer those thwarting cross currents of ego. And when he turned his gaze on you, it was with that clarity. We heard a story recently of a woman who, here in India, who had gone through a very grievous loss in her life. A loved one had died suddenly, and she was suffering a great deal. And Swami was having a satsang, and he came into the room, and she was sitting, there were hundreds of people in the room, but he just happened to catch her eye, just for a moment. He didn't say anything. He probably didn't even know who she was. But just in that moment, he caught her eye. And with that clarity of perception, she said in that instant, all that grieving was taken away, because he drew out that negative thought pattern in the light of his own consciousness. And so the practice of Kriya is such a gift to be able to, we try to have the right attitude and form good habits, excuse me, and all the self-discipline that is important and is necessary on the spiritual path. But Kriya is the shortcut. It's as though we get extra high-octane gas in our tank, and we don't have to be pulling that bullock cart with our own shoulders, but we're powered by that extra prana that dissolves these vortices in the flow, the positive magnetic flow of prana, and then ultimately releases them. Kriya Yoga is the promise of freedom, and to practice it, Master said, all those who follow this path to the end, and he said, not just for sticking to it grimly, but with commitment and dedication. He said, I or one of our other line of gurus will personally usher them into the astral world. That's a great promise, a promise of freedom and liberation. And so these are the gifts of Kriya. But remember too, that the fruits of Kriya are not just when we're sitting in our meditation bench or on the floor or in our temple. The fruits of Kriya are life-changing. And when we talk about the practicing the presence of God, when we worship God on that altar, remember the poem of Master, when I was blind, I couldn't see a door that led to thee. But now that my sight is clear, I see thee everywhere. And so when we go about our daily work, our daily life, whatever it may be, if we're a housewife, a mother, a student, a retired person, a businessman, it doesn't matter at all. It's the only thing that matters is our own perception of reality, which is purified by the practice of Kriya. So when we go about our daily life, we can, when we think of the different aspects of God, if we see God as light, we can practice that presence of seeing the light in everything, not just the light reflected. We saw some wonderful photos. A photographer and scientists developed a new technique of photography that picked up a certain kind of a wavelength of light emanating from flowers. And it showed first just a picture of that flower taken with regular photographic equipment, and then it showed a picture of that flower taken with this kind of equipment that showed a subtler emanation of light. It was so beautiful as a flower, a rose, a lotus is. When you saw that other kind of light that's inherent there, it was so much more beautiful. And so it is with the practice of Kriya. It opens our eyes to the light within everyone. And sometimes you can go around, I often like to do this when I'm with especially a gathering of devotees, where you just look at them and you see the light in their eyes and the light in their forehead and the light coming out of their heart. And you just, Master said once, I see everything permeated with light, the trees, the flowers. He said, I see you all as beings of light, if you only knew how beautiful you were. And so to take the light that's awakened through the practice of Kriya, and then to try to perceive that in the world around us, that is practicing the presence of God, to feel the love of God, and then to share that with others in kindness and compassion. You know, Ananda has a beautiful work that's happening now in Vrindavan, the Paramahansa Yogananda Public Charitable Trust. And we had the blessing of visiting there a few weeks ago. And it's so inspiring to see, look in the eyes of those serving. It's particularly to help the homeless widows in Vrindavan, and to see the light in the eyes of the staff as they serve these women who have known such suffering in their life, to feel the love in their hearts. It's like being bathed in God, Divine Mother's presence. And so to, again, open yourself to be a channel for that love. And that love is freed by practicing Kriya Yoga, where you're no longer trying to protect yourself, or is this person being nice to me, and what if I'm nice to this person but they're not nice in return? Who cares? You just let that love of God, that love aspect of God, flow out to you, to everyone that you meet. God is also power. And when we're going about our daily life, to put the power of our concentration into whatever we do, that's feeling the presence of God. Again, it was so beautiful to watch Swami Kriyananda bring the power of his concentrated mind to bear on whatever he did, writing, composing, lecturing, counseling people. And that the power that can be brought to bear from a consciousness that's freed of the thwarting cross currents. It's a tremendous power. Remember, Master said that if you took even a little pinch of flesh, there's enough energy to keep a large city in electricity for a week. And yet we think, oh, I'm tired, I didn't sleep well last night, I had a hard day at work. We haven't begun to touch the full potential of who we are and our divine birthright. But Kriya Yoga gives us the ability to start freeing up that energy. And in that, there is also the presence of God. And then finally, I'll just touch on this. I'm trying to see what time we have. Oh, we have a little more time. Okay. We'll talk about several other things then. But the peace of God, you know, the world is in such a turbulent state, but peace is a dynamic power that we experience in deep meditation. And the more we can tap into that, and then wherever we go, we share that peace. I know many times we have been in very difficult situations. Where there was one situation where we were with Swami Kriyananda, and we found ourselves at night in the city of San Francisco, in a very, very bad part of town. We had gone out to do an engagement, and we were walking back to the car, and there was a lot of crime in this area and drug users, and it was a scary area to be in at night. There were about 5 or 6 of us with Swami Kriyananda. But I could just feel Swami enveloped all of us with the power of peace in a consciousness that was connected with God. And we just walked through that part of the city as though nothing could touch us, and nothing did touch us. And so all of these are aspects of God that Kriya helps us to tune into, and then in our daily life we can apply them. Peace and love and light and joy. And Kriya Yoga helps us to be able to tap into these qualities within us. And then finally, always remember that ultimately God comes to us. We can't force His presence. We can't say, I have done so many Kriyas, I have meditated so many hours, you come to me. There's the wonderful story Master told where the Lord Indra sent his one of his disciples, I believe it was Narada, was it? Narada out, and he said, I want you to go out into the world, and I want you to find people everywhere, and I want you to take notes, and then I want you to report back to me the greatest of all my disciples. And so Narada very willingly went out into the world, and the first person he met was this ascetic yogi. And he had mammoth Rudraksha beads, and he had performed great asceticism. And he said, you tell the Lord that, and he said, and Narada told this man, the Lord has asked me to find the greatest of all of his devotees, and he will appear to him. And he said, you need look no further. You have found him. I have practiced years of austerity, and I have meditated for hours and hours, and practiced self-mortification and so forth. And you go tell your Lord that he should appear to me immediately. And Narada was very impressed. And but he kept doing as the Lord instructed him. And then he saw this funny fellow who was he was a farmer, and he was a little inebriated, and he was but he was chanting God's name. He was trying to put the fence posts in holes to create a fence around his field. But he was a little inebriated, so he was kind of staggering around, and Narada thought, oh, well, I'll just check this out. And he said, excuse me, but can you tell me, the Lord has asked me to find the greatest of his devotees, and he will appear to them. And he said, oh, well, I'm nothing really. I'm just a humble farmer, but I love God with all my heart, and I'm always chanting his name. And so Narada wrote it down, and then he went back to the Lord, and he reported, and he said, well, this is an easy choice, God. We found this great ascetic, and he said he's been doing all these austerities for you. And the Lord said, I don't recall this fellow. And then he said, and then Narada was a little puzzled, and he said, well, there was this other man, but I don't even want to tell you about him. He said, no, tell me. And he said, well, he was a little drunk, and he was staggering around. And he said, oh, yes, I know him. He is my dearest devotee. Now I want to show you something. Go and tell both of them that I will appear to them as soon as I finish passing camels through the eye of a needle. And Narada thought, this is a very strange God, but I will do as he bids. So he went down, and first he told the ascetic, the Lord is very pleased with you. And he said he will appear as soon as he finishes passing camels through the eye of a needle. And the ascetic said, what? What foolishness is this? Passing camels through the eye of a needle. I'm done with God and all his foolish ways. I'm going back to the world. And he stomped off. And Narada said, this is very strange. And then he went to the little drunk farmer, and he said, excuse me, sir, but the Lord said he will come to you as soon as he finishes passing camels through the eye of a needle. And he said, oh, my beloved Lord, he who can do any miracle, he will come to me in a moment. And then Narada realized that it's not what's outward, but it's the love of the heart that draws God's presence. And God appeared to this little farmer and blessed him, and he went into a deep, deep state of ecstasy. And so let's remember this, beyond techniques, beyond all of the forms of our spiritual path, remember that in the end, it's love, the love of our heart, that draws the presence of God, because God is love. And when we have His love in our heart, He is already with us. So let's remember this, and let's work very, very hard to do our Kriya practice, to prepare for Kriya practice, but most of all, to keep always, always the love of our heart flowing outward and upward to God.